The world economy once looked to the American consumer to pull it out of recession. Not anymore. Now the world is looking to China and emerging economies where growth is taking hold. At his news conference on Friday, President Obama admitted that economic progress here was, quote, painfully slow. Joining me this morning, the president's top economic advisor, Austan Goolsbee, who's just been appointed chair of the President's Council of Economic Advisors. Thank you for joining us here.
Thank you for having me, Chris.
Thank you very much. I want to ask you what's just happened. The House Minority Leader, John Boehner, has said that that he would consider extending the middle-class tax cuts. If the only option I have is to vote for some of those tax reductions, I'll vote for it, he said on Face the Nation this morning. What is your reaction to that?
Well, I obviously haven't seen the comments, but I noticed the qualifier, if my only choice is, if he's truly saying that we can, as the president called for, get a broad consensus to extend the middle class tax cuts, we should do it.
And he's obviously saying
we shouldn't hold that hostage for the argument about the tax cuts just for the very, very highest income people. So if he is for that, I would be happy. In the past, we have seen some of these circumstances in which what appears to be the offer of doing the sensible thing in the light of day, there's a little bit of a feeling, well, if the president's for it, I'm against it, and then it falls apart.
All right. Well, he does obviously go on to say that he's obviously going to do everything he can to fight to make sure that all the tax cuts are extended. But if this does happen, that he is going to vote for an extension of the middle-class tax cuts, how and do you think that those Democrats who oppose what the president wants to do will be brought on board? In other words, will they also go for just the middle-class tax cuts and get this done by the midterms?
I believe, I'm not a political expert, I'm just a policy guy, but I believe there is a broad consensus, a middle ground, if you will, that Democrats and Republicans and business people and workers can agree on to get the economy growing faster and getting people back to work. It's exactly what the president tried to do and is trying to emphasize in the policies he outlined this week. And we ought to do that. We ought to come together. Now, I have noticed in Congress, there is a bit of a different philosophy, I think, between what Representative Boehner is putting forward and what the president's putting forward. So the president's saying, let's reach out and find this middle ground of what things can get the economy growing. Let's have incentives for small business, for investment, so people want to build factories and employ people in this country, and we give tax relief to the middle class. I would point out that Representative Boehner has a different view and is calling for repealing the rest of the stimulus, which would raise taxes on 110 million middle-class people.
Let's take a few of these step by step. It looks like Representative Boehner, at least if we take him as what he's just said, that he says he will vote for it if that's the only option he has. But I want to ask you, because the president does say this week that he wants to extend the Bush-era middle-class tax cuts, but allow those for the wealthy to expire. Now, one of your former colleagues, Peter Orszag of the OMB, he had an op-ed in the New York Times in which he suggested that higher taxes now would, quote, crimp consumer spending. In other words, that it would sort of harm the economy at this point, and to extend them all for the next 2 years. Is that a goer?
Well, I obviously know Peter Orszag very well. His column was not an economic column, it was a political column. He made the political argument that if we extended them all for 2 years, then the Republicans could be convinced to agree to get rid of the high income tax cuts after the 2 years.
So would you do that?
I don't think that politically is correct. I think Representative Boehner made clear he wants to go back to the tax policy and budget policy of the Bush administration.
But he did make the economic argument that at this time it would crimp consumer demand.
Well, the president doesn't need to take lessons in tax cuts from anyone. He cut taxes for hundreds of millions of people. We have cut taxes across the board. We cut taxes for small business 8 different times. And the president now has a small business bill sitting in Congress that is being held up by some Republicans in the Senate that would cut them 8 different more times.
What does the president mean when on Friday he basically said, quote, certainly there's going to be room for discussion, end quote, on extending those tax cuts for the wealthy if the Republicans and the Democrats can first agree to extend them for the middle class. Has he opened an avenue of negotiation on those tax cuts for the wealthy?
No, I do not think so. The president has been all along, through the campaign, through the administration, quite clear on what I believe the economics is also quite clear, that borrowing $700 billion to extend tax cuts that average more than $100,000 a year to millionaires and even billionaires is the least effective bang for the buck we can have. When he said we will be open to discussion, it was literally in a sentence where he said, we should all be able to agree that what would give some certainty to the economy now would be extending the middle class tax cuts permanently. Let's talk about those other things after we do that.
Everything is about unemployment as it affects people all over this country. So where do you think unemployment will be in the short term? I mean, is it going to come down to below 7% when President Obama was elected?
The CEA and Treasury and OMB issue an official unemployment forecast. So I'm not going to deviate from our official forecast.
Going to stay high?
It's going to stay high. This recession is the deepest in our lifetimes, the deepest since 1929. If you take the people thrown out of work in the 1982 recession, the 1991 recession, the 2001 recession, not only is this is bigger than all of those combined. So more than 8 million people lost their jobs. It's going to take a significant push on our part and time before that comes down. I don't anticipate it coming down rapidly.
So this week, though, the president did announce some $200 billion in tax breaks, also the $50 billion in stimulus for infrastructure building. How many jobs do you think that that's going to create?
Well, obviously, it depends on how you do it, but it could have a significant impact on trying to get investment in factories, by small businesses, in buying equipment, research and development, and job creation in this country. That's the key.
Do you have a sort of a target number?
I definitely do not want to speculate on that. But I will say the point that we must have, the point of those policies, they aren't spending. They're the government giving tax cuts to businesses to invest in this country. That's what they are. And we cannot have a sustained recovery without the private sector standing up. So the president knows that and has said it many times.
And just briefly, as we close, a new report is basically saying that the number of American people living in poverty is about to rise from something like 13.2% to 15%, back to the 1960s levels, which led to the national war on poverty. What can you do in this climate to affect that?
Look, I think the number one thing you can do to address poverty also is the way you address unemployment and the way you address the squeeze on the middle class, and that is get the economy growing and get people back to work. So the kinds of policies the president's putting forward are quite different than what's coming from the other side. They are, let's try to find this broad middle ground in which we have targeted incentives for people to do their investment in this country, not somewhere else. And part of that is infrastructure, and part of that is research and development, and part of that is just old-fashioned moxie. Let's get the private sector stood up so that they can, carry us out of this.
Austan Goolsbee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.